young people turn around and say, we're not living in King's America, we're living in Malcolm's America. They can see it. And that's why he remains a hero and has remained, in the conversation.
Hello, welcome to Cambridge Forum, coming to you live via Zoom. I'm Mary Stack, the Executive Director. Today we're examining the life and enduring impact of a controversial Black leader who, despite his short life, still haunts the American consciousness today, 100 years after his birth and 60 years after his assassination. I speak, of course, of the iconic activist Malcolm X. Malcolm X has been the subject of an autobiography edited by Alex Haley, of numerous biographies, of a biopic by director Spike Lee, and several documentaries about his murder. Yet the man, his philosophy, his meteoric rise from felon to icon continues to fascinate us. Perhaps because he defies easy classification, Malcolm X still haunts and inspires Americans in ways we find hard to understand. Well, one intrepid journalist who decided to piece together all the missing parts to create a new profile of this remarkable political figure is author Mark Whitaker. His book, The Afterlife of Malcolm X, is a meticulously researched cultural history of an enigmatic man, but also a crime thriller, which traces the true story of who really murdered Malcolm X. In addition to being an author, this is his fifth book. Mark is a CBS contributor and a former editor of Newsweek, Washington bureau chief for NBC, and a managing editor for CNN. So welcome aboard, Mark.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so congratulations. This is a wonderful study of a man, his thinking, his life's work, and his long-lasting impact. You said, quote, "The book is not a biography. It's the story of what really made Malcolm the figure he is today, even more so than what he accomplished while he was living." Is that why you called the book The Afterlife of Malcolm X?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, when you think about what Malcolm X stood for and how he was viewed at the time of his assassination 60 years ago, he was still a very controversial figure. He had risen to national consciousness as the spokesman for the Nation of Islam, preaching a gospel of racial separatism, describing white people as devils. Then in the last year of his life, he had split from the Nation of Islam and publicly disavowed some of his more controversial views, traveled the world, made pilgrimage to Mecca and so forth. But it was very much a work in progress. And then he was assassinated. And if you read the headlines of the day he was assassinated or the day after in the New York Times and other papers, he was described as a menacing militant figure and so forth. So if the story had ended there, we would probably not be talking about him today, or we wouldn't be talking about him in the same way. But this remarkable thing happened, which is almost from the beginning, after he was assassinated, his legacy started to grow and grow and grow. First with the publication of the autobiography of Malcolm X, which came out in hardback in the fall after his assassination, and then in paperback when it really became a bestseller the next year, becoming one of the most read and most important books by a Black figure probably in American history. Then he provides inspiration in the 1960s for the leaders of the Black Power movement, the Black arts movement, for athletes like Muhammad Ali, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, John Carlos. Then in the 80s, at a time when his memory was starting to fade a little bit, he's rediscovered and re-embraced by pioneers of hip hop. Then you have the Spike Lee movie, which comes out in 1992, and all the X hats and other merchandise that sort of created this awareness of Malcolm among a younger generation. Stretching all the way into this century, where Barack Obama, in his memoir, Dreams from My Father, talks about how Malcolm was a formative influence on him. He's an inspiration to the leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement. There's an opera that had been written in 1986 and sort of forgotten that gets revived and plays in New York with an Afro-futurist staging. So you have even sort of the Black Panther generation discovering Malcolm for the first time. So my book is not another biography. It is the story of all of these ways that all of the people he influenced posthumously and how he was reinterpreted and how his legacy and legend continued to grow over the decades.
That's quite an amazing legacy, really, over the course of 60 years. So let's start with the very beginning. So the real name, Malcolm Little. He's from Omaha, Nebraska. On the face of it, a very unlikely savior, barely a survivor. Both parents are politically active, and so the family ends up being targeted by the Ku Klux Klan. They have to leave the state for Michigan, and when Malcolm is 6, his father is found dead on the railroad tracks. His mother is so traumatized by this, she ends up being institutionalized. He's then placed in a series of foster homes, and he excels in school, but he's discouraged by white teachers from becoming a lawyer, which is what he wants to be. He then drops out in the 8th grade, somehow ends up in Harlem in this sort of underworld of drug use and petty crime, earns the name of Detroit Red. Was that because he had red hair or he dyed it red? He dyed it red.
It was red. It was red. Yeah.
It was red. Then by the time he's 21, he's in jail, doing 7 years for burglary. But his secular descent becomes his route to religious salvation, because when he's in jail, he discovers Islam, drops his slave name, almost dropped his book cover there, and rises to fame, and then becomes the militant voice of the civil rights movement. So how and where do you think Malcolm discovered his style and his presence, and most importantly, his voice?
Well, it's interesting because another part of my book is studying all the ways in which even his life story has been told. So the version in the autobiography, which was ghostwritten by Alex Haley, as you said, and the final version of which Malcolm never saw. So we don't actually know whether the book that we all know is the book that he would have even necessarily approved. But it leans very heavily on this idea that Malcolm was sort of a lost soul and had descended pretty far into a life of petty crime and drug use and so forth, and was rescued by the Nation of Islam and Elijah Muhammad before he ultimately became disillusioned with them. Now, subsequent biographies have, based on research and reporting on his life, have told a slightly different story. So there was a biography. There have been more than probably a dozen different biographies of various sorts. But the two best known, both of which won the Pulitzer Prize, were a biography by Manning Marable, an academic historian, that came out in 2011, I believe, and then another biography by a veteran journalist named Les Payne and his daughter that came out in 2020. Now, there's a tragic irony in all of these books the autobiography, the Manning Marable biography, and the Les Payne, all three books, the authors themselves never lived to see the publication of the book. That
Wow.
both Manning Marable died days before his book was published, and Les Payne suffered fatal heart attack several years before his book came out. So what Manning Marable makes the case that Malcolm's worldview, sort of nationalist, was already heavily influenced and on the way to being formed well before he joined the Nation of Islam because of his parents. Because both of his parents, his father was a preacher and had side jobs and so forth, but both of them were very active in the Black nationalist movement of Marcus Garvey,
Mm.
who was, the leader who argued that things were so bad for Black folks in America that they needed to find a homeland somewhere else, in the Caribbean or in Africa. And his father, even though he died or was killed, again, as you say, there's a lot of questions surrounding his father's death. But when Malcolm was very young, his father used to take him around while he was preaching and giving talks. So he already had that model. His mother, meanwhile, who came from the Caribbean, was a real stickler for education, and for really encouraged all of her children to comport themselves with dignity and so forth. So I think a lot of the things that he later became known for, and that the autobiography might suggest, all sort of came about while he was in prison or as a result of his conversion to the Nation of Islam, actually were there even before that. And then the other, question is how much, while he was a minister for the Nation of Islam, he, in every speech he gave credit to Elijah Muhammad
Mm.
for saving him, for the whole ideology and teachings of the nation. And it is true that Elijah Muhammad, that there was an existing religious organization led by Elijah Muhammad when he joined it. But Malcolm himself was almost single-handedly responsible for the vast expansion of the Nation of Islam and hundreds of thousands of people joining it, and so forth. So it is, once he's out on his own in the last year, he's completely speaking for himself. But during the decade in which he's a spokesman for Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam, there's sort of this tension between what did Malcolm actually believe and what was he preaching simply because his job was to be a mouthpiece for the nation.
And he alludes to that a few days before he's killed. He
Yes.
says he's now owning his own voice and his own thoughts.
Yes.
But I find it interesting because they've both come from, well, Martin Luther King came from a preaching church background, and Malcolm's influenced by having had a church background, his father. But their deliveries are so different. I mean, Malcolm is urgent and angry and assertive. That's how I always remember him. He didn't mess about. He just cut to the chase.
Yeah.
And you say his incredibly direct style was very powerful, and that was the secret to his greatness. And when we look at him now, I mean, I think that's part of the lasting appeal. He's so modern and relevant. It could be now that this guy's talking. You never get that sense with Martin Luther King.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very lofty,
Yeah.
and you're clearly in a church kind of thing. I think he's a great orator, don't get me wrong, but the directness of Malcolm was so forthright, and he saw ahead the importance of direct communication, I think.
It's really interesting because, as you know, there's a lot of discussion these days about what kind of communication is effective in politics and activism today. And the idea that particularly people who are upset about what's going on in the country right now and want, you know, to figure out how to oppose it, that there aren't enough leaders who can say go on a podcast and speak in an authentic way, in a direct way, and so forth. Well, all of those qualities you can see in Malcolm, right? And he relished. I mean, he loved. There weren't podcasts in those days, but at any opportunity he had to go on a radio program, to debate his critics, to go on a college campus, speak to college students, he would take. And as you say, his style, it's interesting because over and over again, people who actually heard him speak said that based on his reputation and the way he was described in the press, they expected someone who would be really scary and angry and so forth. But in fact, even though he had a very powerful message, he delivered it in a commanding but almost sort of professorial way, right? And there's a line, John Carlos, the great sprinter, who was one of the two sprinters who raised their fist in the air at the Mexico City Olympics in 1968, who had grown up in Harlem and sort of followed Malcolm around. He was so taken by him. He has a line in his autobiography. He said, describing Malcolm's influence on him as a teenager, he said, he grabbed hold of my frustrations and turned them into logic. Sonia Sanchez, the great Black arts movement poet, still alive today, described the first time she heard Malcolm speak in Harlem on a drizzly day in the mid-1960s. She was sort of a convention. She was working for CORE, the civil rights organization, very mainstream sort of activist. And a little dubious, she had heard about Malcolm. She said, let me go see. And she said she found him as he was talking, just nodding her head and saying, yeah, that makes sense. That's logical. That makes sense. Right. So he had I interviewed Anthony Davis, the great composer, Pulitzer Prize winning composer who composed the Malcolm X opera. And he said that when he was thinking about composing music for that character in the opera, he thought of Miles Davis, right? He thought King to him sounded more like John Coltrane, right? Soaring, spiritual, but almost kind of unattainable, right? Whereas Miles Davis has a sort of a conversational style. He has a sense of humor, as though he's talking to you.
And he's cool.
Yeah, and he's cool.
He has that quality of.
Yeah, no, and he had, and again, to this day, the glasses that Malcolm wore are still incredibly fashionable, right? I mean, he was an incredibly handsome, charismatic man, but also he had this sense of style, and also just the way he spoke. I mean, one of the reasons the earliest appearance of Malcolm in hip hop, I mean, later there are lyrics referring to him, but we're actually just sampling his voice. Early hip hop pioneers, Keith LeBlanc, Public Enemy, KRS-One, just taking snippets of his speeches that had been recorded and were on LPs at the time, and just sampling his voice because it sounded almost like rap before rap existed.
So looking back now to the two icons at that period, there's Malcolm and there's Martin Luther King. They only met once.
Right.
They had very different views about how to solve the problems, the race issues in the United States. How different were they about their solutions? There's that analogy in your book, the sword and the shield between the two of them. They never did work together.
At the time, they were almost universally viewed, both by white America and within Black America, as polar opposites and antagonists. And for a long time, Malcolm, publicly mocked King and his nonviolent message. And King was a little bit more polite, but he had sort of slightly patronizing things to say about Malcolm. But today, there's among not just me, but distinguished historians and biographers, much greater emphasis on what they had in common. Now, this is partly because there's been a lot of new attention to how much more radical King's message became in the last 3 years of his life, after the sort of golden age of the civil rights movement that sort of started arguably with Brown versus Board of Education, the Montgomery bus boycott, through the Selma March. In the last 3 years, he takes the movement north to Chicago, faces all kinds of opposition there. We see the Watts Rebellion at the beginning of sort of, the urban rebellions of the late 60s. He starts to try to turn the focus from Jim Crow, discrimination, and voting rights to economic issues like jobs and housing, and finds that actually, white people are much less supportive of Black advancement in those areas. Whereas Malcolm, as we discussed earlier, in the last years after he left the Nation of Islam, had become, if not more moderate, certainly more interested in political rights. He gave a speech called The Ballot or the Bullet, basically saying Black folks should exercise their right to vote before resorting to violence. So again, we don't know. I mean, they did meet only once, as you said. It was in the spring of 1964, just after Malcolm had left the Nation of Islam. He went to Washington to witness a debate over the 1964 Civil Rights Act on Capitol Hill, and King was there, and Malcolm sort of positioned himself in the hallway outside of a room where King was giving a press conference, so they would run into each other, and they shook hands, and they smiled, and so forth. So, it's tempting to think that if Malcolm had lived and a King had lived longer, they might have formed more of an alliance. We don't know. But I think that one of the reasons that people are sort of at pains now to make the comparison between King and Malcolm is because Malcolm's analysis of race relations, sadly, has turned out over the decades to remain more accurate than King's more hopeful, I have a dream vision. The other point that I make in the book, but the sword and the shield is a metaphor from the historian Peniel Joseph. And he basically, in that metaphor, Malcolm is the sword. He's the one sort of prosecuting the case against white America, and King is sort of the shield, defending or standing up for Black rights and for white supporters of the Black cause. But King's focus was primarily on legislative progress, right? Ending Jim Crow, voting rights, and so forth. Later, an economic message, but all sort of in the realm of policy. Whereas Malcolm was increasingly interested in fighting those battles, but where he began was with psychology and culture, right? His primary message was that for Black folks to be truly free, they had to liberate themselves from the stereotypes and the self-loathing and so forth that had been foisted upon them by Black society. And that's why he was such, a proponent of Black culture, and becomes a hero to, the Black arts movement in the 60s, the hip hop generation to this day. Who are the biggest stars of today in popular music, I would argue Beyonce and Kendrick Lamar. Both of them have invoked Malcolm X in their work, in their songs, right?
Mm.
And the emphasis on Black pride and Black dignity and embracing Black history and studying Black history is another reason, and we can get to this later, why he can be seen simultaneously as a hero to people on the left, in the middle, like Barack Obama, and even on the right, like Clarence Thomas.
Okay, there's a couple of questions have come in.
Mhm.
You mentioned this, talk about this in the book. Was Malcolm anti-Semitic? There's a kind of a mixture of.
Yeah, yeah. Well, he was certainly, people have said that about him. What I would say is there's no question that he said some very critical things about the behavior of Jewish business owners in Black communities. And also, he was quite critical he was a supporter of Palestinian rights. So, to the degree that he thought that Israel was standing in the way of Palestinian nationalism, he was critical. But two things. One is he actually admired and said a lot of complimentary things about how Jews, as a minority group in America, had, rather than just, looking for handouts and help from the powers that be, had organized themselves economically and culturally to be in a position of real influence and power within the country. And he basically said Blacks should model themselves on that in many ways. The other thing that's really interesting is that Malcolm's, most of the sort of meaningful relationships, I wouldn't call them friendships, but, they became relationships that Malcolm had with white folks were reporters. And he was, partly because he was very media savvy. He understood that was part of his power. And almost all, if not all, the white reporters who he became close to were Jewish, right? So the best known is Mike Wallace, who narrated a quite critical film documentary about the Nation of Islam that came out in 1959 called The Hate That Hate Produced, but subsequently got to know Malcolm and they actually became friends. And when Malcolm, a commemorative postage stamp came out in honor of Malcolm in 1999, Mike Wallace went to the Apollo Theater and appeared with his daughters and talked about their friendship. A major figure in my book is a journalist named Peter Goldman, who worked for Newsweek magazine for many years. He was a colleague of mine, in fact, when I worked at Newsweek, who interviewed Malcolm in depth a half dozen times while he was alive. Then wrote one of the first major books after the autobiography, and became then very active in trying to exonerate the two men who were wrongfully convicted of his assassination. And another journalist was named M.S. Handler. He was known as Mike Handler of the New York Times. And if you go back and study the coverage of Malcolm in the New York Times, Handler wrote, several dozen major pieces about him that were much more sort of sympathetic than a lot of the rest of the coverage of him at the time. So all of that suggests to me that I don't think that in his bones he was an anti-Semite at all.
Okay, like most charismatic leaders, Malcolm drew antagonism and jealousy, particularly Elijah Muhammad, head of the Nation of Islam, who in many ways was all the things he was not. Anyway, Malcolm confronts him about these sexual liaisons he's been having with young female assistants getting them pregnant, and then standing by watching them being shamed and suspended with the Nation of Islam custom was. So he calls him on this, and obviously that didn't go down well. And I think then he became an enemy. He realized that he was powerful and he was anxious and suspect about him. Then Malcolm also alludes to the fact that he says, I know brothers in the movement who've given orders to kill me. So in the book, you go into great depth to track down, name the whole inquiry, and finally the 5 people that were involved in the murder. But many, many people stood to benefit from Malcolm's death. Of course, we don't know all of them, but maybe you could just give a few minutes to that. We asked the audience this question, and we had a huge range of answers, mostly the CIA, the powers that be, white establishment, that was large in the answers, and the Nation of Islam. So maybe you could just give us a little bit of a take on the other elements that were at play there.
Well, so the official when so in the days after the assassination, 1 gunman was apprehended at the scene. 2 more were arrested within a week or so. And the case that was brought against them a year later and on which they were convicted was that these 3 gunmen operating on their own out of the New York mosque, they were all members of the Nation of Islam, although one of them came from New Jersey, had decided to kill Malcolm because he had been disloyal, essentially, and that they operated completely on their own. Now, that never seemed credible, even then. Also, in the middle of the trial, the 1 gunman who came from New Jersey, after originally claiming his innocence, changed his testimony in the middle of the trial and said, yeah, I actually did take part in the assassination, but the other 2 guys are innocent. But then when he was pressed to give up the names of other people who actually had been his accomplice, he refused to do so. So all 3 of them were convicted, sentenced to life in prison, eventually became eligible for parole. The 2 wrongfully convicted men served a combination of 42 years before they were paroled. We'll talk about this later, but eventually, 55 years later, they were officially exonerated. Okay, so however, from the very start, there were allegations and suspicions that the assassination had been ordered by Elijah Muhammad, because he not only considered Malcolm a traitor but also he wanted to silence him from talking about the women and other things that were embarrassing to the Nation of Islam. For example, the fact that several years before that, Elijah Muhammad had instructed Malcolm to carry on negotiations with the Ku Klux Klan in Georgia over getting a tract of land where Black folks could resettle. So that's one theory, that it was all organized out of Chicago, NOI, Nation of Islam headquarters. There's another that it was either at the behest or with the involvement of the New York Police Department and or the FBI and or the CIA, all of which wanted to eliminate Malcolm, not only because he was the figure who potentially could organize Black folks in America to assert their rights in a way that even King couldn't, and had a credibility, particularly with young Black folks in the North and so forth. J. Edgar Hoover, in his own FBI memos, talked about eliminating the Black Messiah, someone who had the potential to be a Black Messiah. So a lot of people thought, well, Malcolm would have been the Black Messiah, and so they got rid of him for that reason. Then also, Malcolm had spent a lot of the last year of his life trying to establish uh, uh, an alliance between Blacks in America and Black folks overseas, particularly in Africa, who are in the process of declaring their independence, winning independence from the colonial powers, organizing themselves into the Organization of African Unity. And then also he had a project of bringing the United States before the United Nations on human rights abuses with respect to treatment of Black folks in America, which the CIA viewed as a threat, not only because it was embarrassing to the United States, but potentially, could be a sort of propaganda issue in the Cold War at the time. Okay. So there's still a lot of unanswered questions. What we now know, I think, pretty definitively is that the assassination was carried out by the one gunman who confessed, who came from Paterson, New Jersey, and 4 other members of the Nation of Islam from New Jersey, either Paterson or Newark. We don't know how much was known about the specific decision and an attack on Malcolm that day on February 21st, 1965 at the Audubon Ballroom. But we do know that a message had been sent out from Chicago, sort of indirectly by Elijah Muhammad himself and more directly by one of his sons and other of his lieutenants, that Malcolm deserved to die. They called him a hypocrite who deserved death. So there was almost sort of a competition among the security forces, as they were called, the Fruit of Islam, in the various mosques around the country, and particularly on the East Coast, almost to see sort of who could get rid of him first, without the fingerprints necessarily of Chicago being on it. So just a week before he was assassinated, his house had been firebombed, his house in Queens. There were other sort of near miss attempts that looked like potential attempts on his life that had been carried out by hitmen from Philadelphia, from other places. So it wasn't, necessarily a foregone conclusion that he was going to die on that day. He could have been assassinated at other points, but before that.
He was pretty nervous, though. He was pretty nervous.
Oh yeah, no, because he knew he was a marked man, and
he'd had a phone call at the Hilton,
and it was a matter of time. I mean, he said a lot of things that suggested that he knew it was coming. Okay, so the one thing I will say is there is an assumption in some of the conspiracy theories about law enforcement that somehow the NYPD, the FBI, and the CIA were all in cahoots. In fact, it was the opposite. They were not cooperating with each other. They were withholding information from each other, okay? We know that the NYPD quite cynically withheld. Malcolm didn't want a lot of uniformed police around when he spoke, partly because he thought it would scare people away from his speeches. But the NYPD sort of took advantage of that and kind of cynically offered it. And then when he said, I don't want it, they gave him the sort of minimum of protection, right? They also had informants. I mean, all of the NYPD, the FBI, and the CIA all had informants in his camp and were all surveilling him. So they knew that his life was in danger. But interestingly, and I think this is probably, to me, the biggest unanswered question right now, is we now know, as a result of information that has really only come to light in the last decade or so, that within days and weeks after the assassination, evidence linking the assassination to the Newark mosque, and these hitmen from Newark turned up in the FBI files. And the FBI never shared that information with the NYPD or with prosecutors. So the most innocent, and it's not innocent at all, but explanation for that is that the FBI was protecting informants, including perhaps the man who wielded the shotgun that fired the kill shot that killed Malcolm, who might have been an FBI informant, and that was being protected by the FBI. There were other people who had been close to Malcolm who now look very suspiciously like FBI informants. Now, whether that means that the J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI knew that Malcolm was going to be killed on that day by those people, we still don't know. But certainly they knew a lot more than they were sharing,
right,
even with the other law enforcement agencies.
Okay, I just want to ask you something outside of that now, which is, it's kind of interesting how many Black intellectuals end up being drawn to Islam. There's a discipline, there's a structure, there's a very rigid, controlled organizational thing to it. It's very powerful. Do you think that's the draw more than the actual religious dogma itself?
Well, I think you have to distinguish between the Nation of Islam and sort of Orthodox Islam. There's no question that the Nation of Islam, which, sort of borrowed some elements from international Orthodox Islam, but was largely an invention of a man named Wallace Fard Muhammad, who founded the religion and then was carried on by Elijah Muhammad, was very effective in turning around the lives of a lot of Black folks in the inner city, people who, men and women, men mostly, who had gone to prison, who were on drugs. And again, as you say, a lot of it had to do not with necessarily the religious part of the message, but a message of discipline and of, not drinking, smoking, giving up other vices, imposing sort of a ritual on their lives. And I mean, Malcolm, when he was still with the Nation of Islam, used to say in his speeches that the US government should be thanking and maybe even paying the Nation of Islam because they were taking, people with criminal records off the street and turning them around. And that is absolutely true. Whatever you think of the actual, teachings in the dogma, it had that effect. A lot of, particularly after Elijah Muhammad died, some people followed Malcolm as soon as he broke with the Nation of Islam and joined him in sort of converting to the, more orthodox form of Islam. Others, it took a while until after Elijah Muhammad died in the 1970s. But, the Nation of Islam, after he died, his son took it over, moved it in the direction of Orthodox Islam, but then Louis Farrakhan sort of resurrected, the Nation of Islam as it had existed before. So again, but to the question of so there's no question that there's appeal both of the Nation of Islam variety and of Orthodox Islam in terms of imposing order and discipline and spirituality and so forth on life. But you could say that of other religions that are quite demanding in terms of their practice.
But you think about people like Muhammad Ali. I mean,
but in terms of intellectual, I think it was because you have Ali, you have a lot of musicians and so forth and so on. I think it was a combination of sort of a sense of it was sort of a Black folks religion, particularly in America. but also with connections internationally. And it was also, the critics of King and of the mainstream civil rights movement felt that even like the whole message of nonviolence, was rooted in a kind of Christian passivity, uh,
Mm.
you know, and that Islam, although ultimately teaching peace and brotherhood, was not necessarily telling Black folks to lie down and not resist and not defend themselves in the face of terrible violence. So I think that was also part of the appeal.
Okay, a quick one here. You talk in the book really, and it's true that a lot of people wanted sort of to identify with him. This is a dead hero is very attractive. I'm affiliating myself with this person, and some part of it I own, regardless of whether they're on the right, the left, or the center, as you said. And you do mention, Barack Obama, of course, said he was a very formative influence, and I'm sure he was. But then so does Clarence Thomas. And frankly, I find this quite hard to believe, in that he wants to align himself in some way with Malcolm X, since I can't think of anything. I know you make the point of why, but I still find it really hard to believe that. But you said you've got
Yeah,
to.
there are a lot of people who think Clarence Thomas is full of it in trying to, claim Malcolm X as a personal hero or as a hero to conservatives. I actually make the argument that I think that at least from his perspective, and he's not alone. I mean, Shelby Steele, other conservative Black intellectuals have embraced Malcolm as well. They're embracing one part of his message. I mean, this is the
Mm,
thing about one reason that I think Malcolm becomes a hero to so many different people at different, points on the ideological spectrum and generationally is he was so profound. He contained multitudes, as they said. And so it's possible to just take the things about him that appeal to you, ignore the other ones, and sort of turn him into a personal hero. In the case of Thomas and other conservatives, I think what they respond to is, one, a message of self-help, right? So Malcolm is someone who very clearly said that Black folks, uh, if could not just depend on the kindness and the largesse of white folks. They had
mm.
to organize themselves in any way they could, economically, as well as, politically, with, Black-owned businesses and so forth, Black cultural.
Clarence doesn't believe that too deeply, though.
What? No, 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 no. Well, but that's the thing that the thing about Clarence Thomas is that a lot of his personal behavior is at odds with what he professes. But he does profess it, and he professes it in his legal opinions, as well. For example, another thing where he, declares affinity with Malcolm X is that, Malcolm X was quite skeptical about how committed America would ever be to true racial integration, right?
Mm.
Um, and certainly while he was speaking for the Nation of Islam, but even afterwards. And, I would have to say that, 60 years later, sadly, we are a more integrated society than we were. But it still, is much less so than I think people during the civil rights era, wanted or expected. And then every time we see progress in that direction, we have a backlash, and we're in the middle of a backlash
Mm.
against it now in a big way. Um, all of that would have been completely predictable to Malcolm. Um, so, Clarence Thomas, despite the fact that his wife is white and he vacations with these white, millionaires and billionaires and so forth and so on, if you read his opinions, he's saying, like on affirmative action and so forth, that that one of the reasons he doesn't believe in affirmative action is he thinks that even at largely white university, it's all for show. And they're more interested in virtue signaling than in true equality of accepting blacks as being equal as students, and that black folks would be better off going to historically black colleges and universities. And that's all in his opinions. So, you can say whether he believes them or not, but he's certainly, that's been the basis of a lot of his jurisprudence, and it's been quite influential.
Well, moving away from him for a moment. So now we find ourselves, as you say, in this horrible period again in history. After George Floyd and all the grand gestures that white corporate America made, promising to make good on Black Lives Matter, right now we find ourselves in this other civil rights nightmare in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
Trump issued executive orders early on to dismantle DEI, to erase Black, female, Indigenous history. And funnily enough, the people in your book, like Spike Lee, discovered Malcolm X in their history classes in high school. They actually read his autobiography, which, will that happen? Will that continue to happen? I don't know. Well, Al Sharpton recently described the current situation as white supremacy on steroids. So you said that you didn't think Malcolm would be surprised at these developments right now, but I find that amazing because he was going in such a strong direction. He had created almost a global organization to connect blacks. I mean, he was really going into a much more international realm. And now we're back to square one. I mean, way back. So how do you feel about that?
Well, I think that look, he was not, he was a nationalist. He was called a nationalist. His parents had been nationalists. But unlike previous generation of nationalists, he didn't believe that America was hopeless and that the only hope for black people was to go someplace else. He really did believe in blacks staying in America and fighting the battle. He just believed, unlike King, he would argue, in fighting the battle with any means necessary, which was his most famous phrase. And that was interpreted as a call to violence. But in fact, he was talking about using political power. He was talking about economic power. He was talking about cultural power. So although his analysis was quite tough for the time in terms of the state of race relations, and I think one of the reasons, honestly, that I think he has remained so much in our consciousness, not because there was an effort to create a national holiday or to have, a day when, he was taught in the schools, quite the opposite. It's because of young people, generation after generation, rediscovering him. And why did they rediscover him? Because the reality that they saw was at odds with the official reality of racial progress that they were being taught in the schools, right? And, they were, there's always been this kind of perhaps, well-meaning, but, effort to return over and over again to King and to the victories of the early 60s in terms of telling the American story, right? But the young folks in the inner cities in the late 60s, as Richard Nixon was being, elected, and then in the 80s, in the midst of the Reagan era and the war on drugs and mass incarceration, and even today, the Black Lives Matter generation watching police violence, across the country, to the backlash today, young people turn around and say, we're not living in King's America, we're living in Malcolm's America. They can see it. And that's why he remains a hero and has remained in the conversation. So I think you have to hold in your mind, and I think this is why Malcolm is so interesting to continue to study and revisit, the idea that he stood for this incredibly tough analysis of how bad things were and what the struggle was, but at the same time, the idea of you don't give up on it, right? And I think going back to our first conversation about communication, I think that if everybody, everywhere you go now, people say, well, what do we do about the situation now? Okay, things are really bad. Well, again, Malcolm would say, muster everything that you can, right? First of all, Black folks, I don't think he would be against alliances with white folks of good faith who are not going along with, the white nationalist project of turning the clock back that Trump seems to stand for. But he would also say that, Black folks yet again are kind of, more on their own than they've been in a long time. People are retreating, a lot of people who were professing, as you said, support for all of these programs are now heading for the hills. So Black folks have to use the power that they have, but they do have power. And, I've been thinking a lot about this, particularly as regards culture, right? And one of the things you see recur in our history in America, particularly in race relations, is you have a period of progress, like in Reconstruction, Civil Rights era, Obama presidency, followed by a period of backlash, right, and repression following, so you have Jim Crow, then you have, the Nixon-Reagan era, and now you have Trump, right? And then what is the form of resistance in the face of that backlash? Often it begins with culture, right? In the Jim Crow era, it began with jazz. In the Civil Rights era, gave birth to hip hop, right? Or the backlash after the backlash against the Civil Rights era gave birth to hip hop. As in the midst of all of the ugly stuff that's going on now, Trump's attack on not only DEI, but literally trying to dismantle programs that date back to the 60s, desegregation orders in the South, and so forth. Who are some of the most powerful forces in our culture today? Kendrick Lamar at the Super Bowl, Beyonce, setting records, in concerts around the country. Ryan Coogler's movie Sinners, becoming, the big box office hit of the season. And who's not saying anything about any of that? Donald Trump. Not a tweet about any of them because they're bigger than him. They are more powerful. He understands that. So that is Black power too, and it may not be sufficient, but it means that, that and you can see Malcolm's vision of resistance in those artists and the stance that they're taking, because all of those, those three artists are political beings. What they are doing culturally also has a strong political message of empowerment and resistance.
So I can't resist this. One of the things you said you really liked that impressed you about Malcolm was the fact that he was willing to admit when he got something wrong.
Mm.
And, he changed his stance that we were white devils.
Yeah.
And then after he did his visits to Africa and went on the Mecca pilgrimage and everything, he came back and he changed his views and admitted that.
Yeah.
Do you think he was wrong?
Do I think he was wrong to admit
change
he
his
was
mind.
wrong, or
change his
no?
mind?
I think he was honest. I think he was authentic.
I'm just thinking the way things are playing out.
I think that's, and I think people want to see more of that in their leaders. I mean, I think it's one of the things that I think I don't know why it's so. I mean, I guess it's true for a lot of people. They just have a hard time admitting, but he was, um, he did it in a, again, as we were discussing, just in a very direct, matter-of-fact way. He wasn't going around asking for forgiveness, for having had that message. He just was very clear that his eyes had been opened by going to Mecca, by traveling abroad, seeing that there were white folks of goodwill, particularly white Muslims, um, and that white students who had offered their help to him and he had turned them away. He regretted that. He and I think it just spoke to his intellectual honesty. Look, I think he was a brilliant man. I mean, he dropped out of school in the eighth grade, but I think he was, brilliant. And I think sometimes, you know, the one sign for me, I've always believed, of true brilliance is the ability, to change your mind and to admit it. You know, and
No, I totally concur. The principle, of course, I concur
and
is
and
an
and by the way,
attribute.
just going back to, because most people discover him, or not, still to this day, through the autobiography, which has been read by millions and millions of Americans, of all backgrounds and races and regions and so forth and so on. It is a story apart from, his specific beliefs and the evolution of his beliefs. It is a deeply moving story of human growth and evolution that almost anybody can relate to, and admire, and be moved by.
Very impressive.
Yeah,
Very impressive. With almost no guidance up
yeah,
until the point he goes into jail. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Well, Mark, great book. Thank you so much for your time and the diligence of writing it and the insight. Very, very, I learned a lot
Yeah.
about the man. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mark.